right, hey there, AP European history students. In this recorded slideshow lecture, I am going to talk about the art of the 18th century. In particular, the art movement known as Rococo, which dominated most of the 18th century, and then how there was the Neoclassical art movement, which was a complete rebellion against Rococo. Now, one of the important reasons why we study art in AP European history is because art always reflects culture. We can get a good sense of the times and what the times were like based upon how those times were reflected in the artwork. Same could be said today. No doubt in the future, those historians that want to understand how we live today and what our culture is like will no doubt study our music, our movies, the television shows that we watch. These things are good indicators of our values. Now, in this particular lecture, as we talk about art, where our focus is going to be mostly on France. By the time that we get to the 18th century, Paris has pretty much established itself as the center of the art world, and what's coming out of France tends to influence the art movements elsewhere, in places like Prussia, the Italian states, England. Okay, so first thing we need to do is understand what Rococo is. And in order to do that, I want to take it all the way back to the 1500s and the 1600s, in which we talked about the Baroque art movement. You may remember this particular image that you're seeing here on your screen right now, painted by Caravaggio. This is David with head of Goliath. And you also might remember that this is actually a self-portrait of Caravaggio. Caravaggio painted himself as the slain Goliath, with a very sympathetic and sad-looking David looking upon Goliath. And this is a great example of the Baroque art movement, which, to review, the best way to understand Baroque art is to connect it with the Catholic Reformation or the Counter-Reformation. Whereas there were so many Protestant movements that were iconoclastic, they wanted to destroy art, the Catholics thought, okay, well now here's our chance, we're really good at art. So let's make art for the masses. So that's what the Baroque art movement was. It's for the masses, it's for the average person. So it's very, very dramatic. I mean, scenes like this, David with head of Goliath, you kind of have to look at it. It's pretty gross and disgusting, and it captures your attention. It's very dramatic. In order to enhance that drama, we have chiaroscuro, light, dark. So you have David here, who seems to be basked in the spotlight with his right arm tucked back into the darkness. And that spotlight sensation creates drama. And then, of course, there's a religious theme. This is a scene from the Old Testament of the Bible. So if you were a poor, illiterate commoner and you couldn't read the Bible, like the Protestants wanted you to do, you could look at this great religious artwork that was very, very dramatic, brought to you by the Roman Catholic Church. Okay, so that's what the Baroque art movement was. And Baroque art was the dominant art movement beginning in the 1500s with the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, and then dominated pretty well into the 1600s until you get to the late 1600s as well, through the eras of religious wars. And then things started to change in France, particularly the Palace of Versailles, under the reign of the Sun King Louis XIV. When Louis XIV wanted something different, all that Baroque artwork with its heavy, dramatic imagery, scenes from the Bible, it's very dark, it's very heavy. King Louis XIV wanted something new. Hey, by the way, if you're looking at your screen right now, this particular image, obviously there was no photograph taken of Louis XIV. That particular image was taken in the Hall of Mirrors in the Palace of Versailles, but that's actually an actor who played Louis XIV in a miniseries called Versailles. I've not seen this miniseries, but I thought it was a pretty cool image and it worked for this slideshow. All right, so Louis XIV, in the late 17th century, he requested artwork with more youthful designs. He wants a new generation of artists to come along to create essentially a new vibe for Versailles. And this will be Rococo art. So art movements, you can pretty much understand art movements as a rejection of what came before. It seems like this is what artists of all brands do. Musicians, painters, sculptors. They look at sort of what their parents' generation did and said, I'm not going to do that. That stinks. I'm going to create something that's actually might be the exact opposite of that, or will at least offend people from that generation. We're going to do something new, something dramatic, something bold. That's a rejection of the previous generation's work. And so that's one way in which you can understand art movements of any sort, pretty much at any point in time in history. It's a rejection of the previous generation's work to create something new and bold. So Baroque artwork, it was very religious in design. It was very symmetrical, so it came out of Renaissance art. There was, for the most part, perspective, vanishing points, sort of an ordered structure. It was symmetrical. It was austere. It did not glamorize opulent living. I mean, Caravaggio, if you remember, he was a thug who lived in the streets of Paris, and he painted, or rather he used as models, the poor people of Paris, or the poor people, I'm sorry, he lived in Rome. Let me say this again. Caravaggio, he lived in Rome. He was a thug. He was a gangster. And so he used as models his friends, other thugs who lived in Rome. And so these were not the rich, these were not the opulent, these were not socialites. These were people who you could identify as austere. They were poor. And then, of course, Baroque art is very, very, very dramatic. But that dramatic is also rather heavy. It's biblical. It's dark. All right. And so the Rococo movement that emerges out of Versailles in the late 17th century is going to be a rejection of all of these things. So what does Rococo art shift toward? All right, so we're shifting away from religious. So what's going to replace the religious themes of these paintings? Well, secular themes mostly. So ordinary, everyday, worldly things. You will see some classical imagery in there. So we're going to go back to ancient Greek and ancient Roman culture. You'll see that sneak in from time to time, and I'll explain that when that happens and why the artists do that. But we're shifting away from the religious. We're shifting away from scenes from the Bible. We're going secular, and we're also going natural. You'll see there's a focus on the natural world. A lot of trees and landscapes and mountains and such. All right. Also, we're shifting away from the symmetrical, and we're going towards asymmetry. This I won't talk a lot about because it has mostly to do with the Rococo artwork in architecture and in furniture, and I just don't focus on that in this slideshow. But when you move away from something that's symmetrical to something that's asymmetrical, you're moving away from like sort of an orderly image. Everything's very structured and geometrically perfect, to when you have something asymmetrical, then it's got sort of a flow to it. Think of like waves on a sea. All right, but I'm not going to show you that much artwork that relates to asymmetry. All right, and then austere. The Rococo artwork is going to move away from the rigidity of austere images to things that are more graceful. And also, instead of the heavy drama of Baroque, you're going to have things that are more playful. All right, so these are very, very general things. It's better just sort of to look at the artwork. That'll help me explain it a little bit more. All right, so this is the 18th century that rolls around, and Rococo kind of comes along with the 18th century. And the 18th century is the era of the Enlightenment. There's a sense of progress. There's a sense that things are getting better. And there's sort of a general feeling of happiness. And certainly Rococo art is designed to capture that happiness, playfulness, joy, childish behavior. All of these things would be a great rejection of the Baroque art movement. Okay, so I'm going to talk about several Rococo artists here. And I'll talk about them chronologically. So our first one here is Antoine Watteau, and he's early 18th century, and then I'll work my way through the 18th century, mostly chronologically. And the most important Rococo artist is going to be the final one. So in this lecture, you're going to get a sense of what Rococo art is, and then how it culminates at the end of the 18th century in the 1780s. With the most important Rococo artist that I want you to know, whose name is Jean-Honoré Fragonard. What you're going to see in the 18th century with the Rococo movement is this. It starts off with Watteau here, and he's going to paint things that are slightly daring, slightly bold, slightly revolutionary in terms of content, not necessarily painting style, but in terms of content, a little bit daring, a little bold, slightly naughty, but that daring, that audacity, that boldness, that naughtiness. What's going to happen is each subsequent generation throughout the 18th century, they're going to get even bolder, even more audacious, even more daring, even more naughty, until it culminates with Fragonard. Okay, so let's talk about the artwork of Antoine Watteau, patronized by French aristocrats and French royalty, beginning with Louis XIV, the Sun King. This is the type of stuff that Watteau would paint. And I'm only going to show you one painting by Watteau that I feel like kind of captures his imagery here, or captures his style and the content of what he paints, and that's this. Okay, this is The Feast of Love, painted in 1719. Okay, so what you are seeing here is something that the French called a fête galante, which is a courtship festival. Watteau painted many paintings that looked like this. So here's what you're saying. Couples, men and women paired up, they are in a public park of some sort. But this public park in the early 18th century is out in nature somewhere, and they are courting. They are on a date. They are talking. They are flirting. They are, in some cases, making out. Now, notice that in this particular courtyard area here, Watteau places a classical statue. I'm going to assume that that is a sculpture of Venus, the goddess of love, with a little Cupid draped around her leg. So this is the dawn of Rococo art. It is a great example of this. What do you see when you're looking at this? Well, mostly young people, mostly happy in this really sort of adolescent way. There's an innocence to it. There's a happiness to it. It has sort of this Garden of Eden-like quality to it. These people are away from their work. They are away from the things that they have to take seriously. They are away from church. They are away from business, government, all that stuff. They're here relaxing, loving, and in some cases, making love. But there is, with Watteau's paintings, a darkness to it. There's always a sense that this sensual happiness is fleeting. And I think you can see that in this particular piece with the couple that's walking away. So in the very center of the painting, you see the couple that's standing, that's walking away, and they're looking over their shoulders at the couple. It looks like they're looking at the couple that's being intimate, that's starting to make out a little bit. And they're giving them sort of this wistful look, like, oh, isn't that nice, but we have to leave. And Watteau's artwork tends to have this sense that this perfect place of love, it's really nice, enjoy it while you can, it doesn't last. So that's Watteau. That pretty much captures the dawn of the Rococo art movement. And what we'll see as the 18th century progresses is that Watteau will become too old-fashioned. The idea that all this sensual loving is fleeting, the darkness of Watteau's paintings, the future painters will just get rid of all that, and they'll just celebrate the hedonism of love and making love and all of that. So here's our next generation of Rococo painters, and he is probably the biggest name of Rococo, and his name was Francois Boucher, the most popular painter in France in the 18th century. He spent time at Versailles, he was patronized by French aristocrats, and he delivered the goods, what they wanted. So what do they want? Well, they want female nudes. They want nothing religious. They want sensual, sexual artwork, and he gives it to them. Now, most of what Boucher paints are images from Greek and Roman mythology. Like this particular image right here is an image of Diana preparing for her bath. Diana, the goddess of the hunt. You might notice there's a hunting dog and some dead birds and rabbits and a quiver full of arrows around her. But really the focus here is a naked woman, or two naked women actually. Same here, we have the goddess Venus with her little cupids around, and the little cherubs are helping her do her hair in the morning. Must be nice having little angels do your hair for you in the morning. And she looks listfully down, and this is it. I mean, Rococo artwork. It's artwork that strips away all the heavy austerity, biblical stuff from Baroque. We've got a naked woman. She's beautiful. We don't take life too seriously. There's sort of this quality of, whatever, let's just be happy element to this type of painting, Rococo. All right. Louis XV, King of France. He was the grandson of Louis XIV, and he patronized Francois Boucher to paint more images of naked women from classical mythology, and we are learning a lot about the values of the French royal family and the French aristocracy at Versailles in the middle of the 18th century. Their values are, well, pretty superficial. Naked bodies, lovemaking, not really taking too much seriously. Again, there's sort of this escape from real life and a return to innocence. Now, all of these figures so far have been classical, at least the ones I've shown you from Boucher, but not this one. This is a painting that I find particularly disturbing. This is a portrait of Marie-Louise O'Murphy, who was a real woman, if I can even call her a woman. She was the mistress of Louis XV, one of many mistresses that Louis XV had. She began sleeping with the king when she was only 15 years old, and Boucher painted her portrait. So with Watteau's paintings in the early 18th century, there was a subtlety to them. There was nuance to it. There was also a darkness to it. This idea that sensual love is fleeting, but not with Boucher. Boucher presents us with in-your-face decadence, nudity without modesty. And Boucher is also shifting away from romantic love to really the objectification of the human body. And that's why I find this particular image so disturbing. This is a 15-year-old girl. She was used by the king for a short period of time, and then he cast her aside for yet another mistress. But she's remembered for all time because Boucher painted her. By the way, it's kind of an interesting name, Marie-Louise O'Murphy. The family name is Irish, O'Murphy. So Marie-Louise O'Murphy was a real person. She was the daughter of one of the Irish soldiers who fought with King James II when he was trying to raise an army in Ireland to reclaim his throne away from William and Mary. You hopefully remember the Battle of the Boyne in 1690. Well, this girl's dad was there fighting. He survived the fight, and then when that army fled, they fled to France. And so there were some French people in France who received the protection of the French aristocracy, and in this particular case, the French royalty. This particular painting did become a bit of a sensation. This particular man wrote about it in his book. This is probably one of the most famous figures of the 18th century, Giacomo Casanova. He was an Italian aristocrat, and he spent most of his adult life traveling around Europe. Near the end of his life, he wrote The Story of My Life, his memoirs, talking about, or rather writing about, what life was like in Europe, at least among the aristocrats and the royalty of Europe in the 18th century, because he traveled all around, met aristocrats, met kings and queens. And so today historians appreciate this book because it's great insight into what life was like in the 18th century. This book, and also, if you remember, I mentioned before another English traveler, her name was Lady Montagu. She wrote from the perspective of a woman, an English aristocratic woman, about pretty much the same courts that Casanova visited. Now, Casanova is remembered for all of his affairs. As he traveled around going from town to town to town, he had many women that he met and he seduced, so much so that the name Casanova today is synonymous with being a womanizer. If you are a man and somebody calls you a Casanova, it pretty much means you're the type of dude who's never going to settle down. And Casanova was obsessed with the painting Marie-Louise O'Murphy, and in his book fabricated a whole story around it that was fabricated, it was totally false, saying that he had glimpsed her naked and he was so taken by her beauty that he commissioned Boucher to paint this portrait of her. And interestingly, he said even her name means beauty, because in Greek, the word for beauty is omorphia, which is pretty close to O'Murphy. So yes, Casanova. So you see the direction that Rococo art is going. It is getting naughtier, naughtier, naughtier. Boucher himself liked this portrait so much that he positioned his wife in the same way and painted her in the same way. And again, there's absolutely nothing subtle about this. It's just extremely sexual. Denis Diderot, one of the greatest philosophers of the 18th century, he loved Boucher's work, and he thought Boucher was the greatest painter of his time. And Boucher certainly was the most famous painter coming out of France in the middle of the 18th century. And of all the artists at the time, Diderot loved Boucher's work the most, but he despised that particular portrait that Boucher did of his wife. For Diderot, this was too much, and Diderot proclaimed that Boucher had effectively prostituted his wife by painting her like that. Another patron of Boucher was this woman, Madame Pompadour. Madame Pompadour was another mistress of King Louis XV. However, she lasted a lot longer than Marie-Louise O'Murphy because she was an adult woman and far more manipulative, and she used Boucher sort of as a propagandist. Madame Pompadour was a seductress, to say the least. She met the king in the Hall of Mirrors at a party. She seduced him, he brought her back to his bedroom, and that was pretty much it. And she kept seducing him for the next 20 years. And part of that seduction was having Boucher paint her like he does here. She wants to show off her beauty. No matter how old she gets in real life, she's always young and beautiful and graceful, as she is in this painting, which she will have hung in Versailles. And she's also intelligent, too. She's seen here in a beautiful dress reclining, but she's also reading. So this is an interesting image. And I think there is something very 21st century about Madame Pompadour's attitude, because we today are very much driven by images. Today, we don't need Boucher or any painter to paint us because people have phones and they take selfies and they post selfies of themselves trying to promote a particular image of themselves. That's all Madame Pompadour was doing. Create this image of herself so that the king would choose her over any other woman, or at least, because that might not have been true, at least keep her around, which he did for 20 years. So this is Rococo. It's decadent. It's unashamedly sensual, and it's French. And these are still qualities that today a lot of people tend to associate with the French. Oh, they are very passionate. They make love. There are beautiful women. They are the opposite of Puritans. And so, did the rest of Europe find this annoying? Well, yes and no. Yes, a lot of people found it annoying outside of France, and even within France, too. Let me say this. This artwork is being produced by the French aristocracy. This becomes important in the late 18th century. French aristocracy and the king, so French royalty too, but just the upper echelon of people in France. This is not the artwork that most of the people enjoy. Or at least, you obviously don't have commoners patronizing these artists. And this artwork, this Rococo artwork you see here, is what's being patronized and appreciated by the aristocracy, not the majority of people in France. Okay, so that's in France. Outside of France, yes, they see these things as annoying. All these values of decadence, of sex without intimacy, these are things that are not valued by people or by many cultures as a whole outside of France. So yes, they find Rococo annoying, but as annoying as they find it, it's still influential, and many painters outside of France begin copying it. And a great example of that is up in England. One of the greatest Rococo painters up in England was Thomas Gainsborough, lived in the middle of the 18th century. So what you get with Gainsborough up in England is, and the English don't like the French, they don't want to copy the French, but Gainsborough is one of these artists who's inspired by what's coming out of France, so he just alters it to make it English. So he celebrates nature, the landscape. This is the road to market. A family leaving their estate, going to town, going to market. There is in the middle of this painting a beautiful young woman, but she is fully clothed, she is with her family, so we, the viewers, are less apt to sexually objectify her, like Boucher was painting women down in France at the time. But there still is this sort of Garden of Eden quality to Gainsborough's paintings. There's an innocence to it. There's a focus on nature. It's a secular image. There's nothing religious about this. There's a sense of peace and happiness in this painting. And that is very much an influence of the Rococo style. Hey, by the way, the road to market is actually not in England or in Europe. It is here in Ohio at the Toledo Museum of Art. I know that each and every one of you want to take a trip up to Toledo to see The Road to Market by Thomas Gainsborough. The other English adaptation of Rococo art was a focus on children. Thomas Gainsborough had two daughters, and he painted them at least a couple of times, and here they are. Gainsborough celebrates childhood. This is new in the 18th century. Previously, in European history, childhood was something to be survived. Children were looked upon as these miniature adults. They were expected to fend for themselves at a very young age. Childhood was something that really was not protected. As soon as you were old enough to work, you were expected to work. Disease was so rampant that a lot of children didn't survive childhood. Remember the story of Queen Anne of England, who had 17 children, none of which made it out of childhood. But then things start to get better in the 18th century because health and medicine started getting better. The best example of this in the late 18th century, smallpox inoculations were developed. And that is a shining example of 18th century Enlightenment thought. Science, progress, things are getting better. So now Gainsborough looks upon his own children, and most importantly, childhood as a whole, as something that's precious. So instead of looking at children as miniature adults, and their job is to sort of get tough as quick as possible and grow up, now Gainsborough, in terms of the way he paints his own children, presents childhood as something playful, innocent, and wonderful. And maybe children have something to teach us adults in terms of how we should live our lives, that we should try to recapture some of our own childhood innocence. Gainsborough does that in painting, in philosophy, and in literature. That's what Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the French philosopher, was trying to do at this exact same time in history with his writing down in France. Childhood as a stage in our life cycle that is something precious, that is something that should be protected, and as a stage in our own lives that we should always remember. That comes out of the Rococo art movement and 18th century philosophy, particularly the philosophy of Rousseau. Okay, the next Rococo artist, we're headed back down into France, of course, is this man, Jean-Baptiste Greuze. I'm only going to show you two paintings that Greuze painted. The first is this one, Girl with a Dead Canary. Yep, a girl with her dead pet bird. Well, what do we see here? She looks to be probably a teenage girl, and she had a pet bird, and the pet bird has died, and she is crying. Clearly what's being communicated in this painting are the sentimental emotions that we all have, but are traditionally considered to be effeminate. If any of you have had a pet that you loved and that pet died, then you can probably sympathize with the girl in this particular painting. It's painful to lose a loved one, even if that loved one is a pet. The subject here is a young female, but there were adult men that saw this painting and cried because they understood the sentiment that was being communicated by it. So Greuze, not really a naughty painter like Boucher was, but what he does try to capture is sentimentality. Again, that natural, innocent sentimentality. That's Greuze. I always like to throw this one in here. Greuze also saw Benjamin Franklin, and Benjamin Franklin came from the American colonies to meet French aristocrats and the French royal family to try to get money and military support for the American Continental Army, who was fighting the French old enemy of England. And of course, Ben Franklin was successful in that endeavor. He got French royal support for the American colonists, and because of that French support, we won the American Revolution. Thanks, Benjamin Franklin. And for Greuze and for a lot of other people in France who had the opportunity of meeting Benjamin Franklin, first of all, he was a celebrity when he showed up in Versailles and in Paris. And as the French, and especially French Rococo artists like Greuze, were celebrating nature, they looked upon the Americans as these noble savages, sort of coming out of the woods of North America. And that we Americans, at least in the 18th century, embodied this more natural, primitive state. Which is probably why Greuze painted Benjamin Franklin with a fur coat on. By the way, Benjamin Franklin knew this, and he knew that the French had this opinion of us, so he played it up. He would even wear a fur hat. Benjamin Franklin also fully embraced the French Rococo culture. He would have been 71 years old when this portrait was painted of him, And by reputation, it still did not stop him from flirting with women throughout his stay in France. And in the 1770s, of all the women in France, this would have been the most famous woman. We will learn much more about Queen Marie Antoinette when we study the French Revolution. She was the youngest daughter of the Austrian Empress Maria Theresa, and Marie Antoinette was a product of the diplomatic revolution of 1756. In order to consecrate the alliance between Austria and France, this Habsburg princess, Marie Antoinette, married the future king of France, Louis XVI, when he was still but a prince. Now, Marie Antoinette will be remembered for her opulent living. She wore a different dress every single day of her life while she was Queen of France, but she was also inspired by the cult of nature and the Rococo art movement. As we see here, this painting, which was done by a woman, by the way, so there were female painters at the time, at least in late 18th century France. Here is Queen Marie Antoinette holding a rose and a rather informal hat. And on the grounds of Versailles, Marie Antoinette has built the Hameau de la Reine, the Queen's Hamlet. And here it is. This is where Marie Antoinette would go when she wanted to feel closer to nature, when she wanted to feel like she was more of a commoner. Here at the Queen's Hamlet, there was a working mill and a dairy farm, so that literally Marie Antoinette could go and milk cows. It is still there, this in Versailles today. This is a modern picture of it. To give you a sense of how big the grounds at the Palace of Versailles are, I have never had the opportunity to visit the Hameau de la Reine because whenever I've visited Versailles, I've always been a tourist on a tight schedule. I've only visited Versailles with students on student trips, and it's a half an hour walk from the Palace of Versailles, from the actual palace where the Hall of Mirrors and all that is, to the Queen's Hamlet. So it would be, half hour out, half hour back, and then time to spend around the grounds. I've just never had the time to do it. It's sort of, for me, impressive that Marie Antoinette had this built so that she could actually go and milk cows. But you also have to place this within context. The real peasants of France in the 1780s are starving to death. There's going to be a revolution in 1789. So the Queen's Hamlet will be seen by many people as being built in bad taste, because while Marie Antoinette is playing a peasant woman for fun, the real peasant women are starving. But that aside, the Queen's Hamlet is a good example of how the Rococo art movement has developed throughout the 18th century. It's a good example of the Rococo art movement. And then we arrive to this guy. Just like I said at the beginning of the lecture, the Rococo art movement, as I present it, tends to culminate with Jean-Honoré Fragonard. And there's one particular work by Fragonard, which is probably his most famous, that I would like for you to know, because I think it's the best example of Rococo art and sort of the apex of how Rococo art developed throughout the 18th century. So Fragonard painted some classical images. He also painted some images of childhood and nature and innocence, like you see here with The Grape Gatherer of 1755. But mostly he focuses on those great French qualities of romance and sensuality and naughtiness. So you have images like this one painted not long before the French Revolution, The Stolen Kiss, an image of a young man planting one on the cheek of a woman who was not expecting it. But Fragonard likes to do things even more bold and daring than even Boucher. Now, this particular image of hot cockles probably doesn't strike you as too much because there's not this same in-your-face nudity that Boucher painted until you know what he's actually painting. It's interesting. This painting is very different from a lot of Boucher's paintings in that it's sort of grainy. It's almost impressionistic. Most of his paintings are done very, very precisely, or like a photograph. And this one is not. It's a little blurry. Now, one thing that is similar with other paintings by Fragonard that you see in this one is the large background of nature. He always has a lot of nature in his paintings, very similar to Watteau. Just like Watteau's paintings, you get the sense that you're deep in nature in some park or someplace way out in the woods where you have mostly teenagers making out. Okay, so Hot Cockles. Here's what Hot Cockles was. It was a game that teenagers would play, and it went like this. Whoever was it had to close his or her eyes and bury their face in somebody's lap. And if you were a man, you would close your eyes and face down into a woman's lap, and if you were a woman, into a man's lap. And then somebody would come up and spank you. And then you had to guess who spanked you. And if you guessed correctly, well, then you got to spank them back. And that was it. That's the entire game right there. Hot cockles. But it's obviously this game that young people would play that had this sexual quality to it. And that's what Fragonard enjoyed painting. And that's a nice transition into his most famous painting that I would like for you to know. Here it is in its entirety. The full original title of it was The Happy Accidents of the Swing. Today it's usually just simply referred to as The Swing, and it was painted on or around 1767. So let's take a moment to analyze The Happy Accidents of the Swing. First of all, let's check out the nature. The whole top half of the painting are these gnarly branches and trees and green and leaves and some sunlight creeping in. It's really beautiful nature. And then the bottom half of the painting is where all the human activity is. And we have all the great elements of a Rococo painting. Let's focus on that now. So just like in Watteau's original Rococo paintings in the early 18th century, we're deep in nature where we have some sort of fête galante, a courtship festival going on. But let's look specifically at what's going on. Okay, so you've got the cupids, you've got the classical sculptures around there. So those are symbols of classicism and of love. We're bringing back the freedoms of the Greeks and the Romans. Okay, so there's that. And then there's what your eye immediately focuses on, the young girl on the swing. Or let's not call her a young girl. Let's call her a young lady on the swing. Okay, so she's on a swing. What's a swing do? A swing is fun. You go back and forth. You feel the wind in your hair. You go back and forth and back and forth. The woman going back and forth is sexual imagery for what I hope is obvious reasons. Now, but she's still just a young lady on a swing. Notice that she's being pushed on the swing, but not really pushed, rather pulled by tethers on the swing by a man, an adult man. He's in the background there. You can see him. This man is a friend of the family. One interpretation I read of this painting was that he was a priest. So he'd be like, the priest of the church where she attends. This is France, so everybody's Catholic. But I can't say that for certain, and he's not dressed like a priest. But suffice it to say, he's an adult man. He's a friend of the family. He represents authority and the fact that the family is a good family. It's a family of means, and that she is a respectable young lady. The reason why he is pulling her on tethers and not pushing her like we would push anybody else today on a swing is because he respects her, and he is therefore not going to touch her. This is an adult man that has no interest in this young woman as a romantic partner. He looks upon her as a nice young lady from a respectable family. And that's how she wants to present herself, at least to him. Now let's talk about the happy accident of the swing. The accident is the shoe. You'll see that the young lady has kicked her shoe off. That's the accident. Oops, I lost my shoe. It was an accident. Accident meaning I didn't mean to do it, it just accidentally came off. But that is a lie, because she's intentionally kicking her shoe off to her lover, who is, appropriately, hiding in the bushes below, and is clearly positioned so that he can look up her dress. So that makes this painting naughty, daring, and bold. But this painting, for me, is the best example of Rococo art and a reflection of the culture and the values of the French aristocracy in especially the second half of the 18th century. It's this female central character in this painting and the hypocrisy that she represents, because she represents two things. First of all, she is a fine young lady, able to walk off to the park with an adult family friend, this adult man who looks upon her as a fine, chaste, good, young lady, and she presents herself like that to him. Her fine dress, which represents her family status, is symbolic of her being a proper young lady. But that propriety is totally superficial, because she's also the bad girl with her boyfriend hiding in the bushes while she's flashing him and, oops, kicking her shoe. And that shoe, oh, it was an accident. No, it wasn't. This is an image of fake superficiality, and the French loved it. It was almost as if they all understood it. Yes, we're the French aristocracy. We're rich. We're powerful. We can pretend to be proper, but everybody knows we're really bad. And that is The Happy Accident of the Swing by Jean-Honoré Fragonard. Hey, so one last thing about The Happy Accidents of the Swing that I cannot explain. I don't know what Fragonard, I don't know what he was thinking when he did this, when he put this element in the painting. But art historians have pointed out that the guy in the bushes, the secret boyfriend there, Fragonard painted him in nearly the exact same position of Michelangelo's Adam in the creation of Adam, which is of course the centerpiece of the Sistine Chapel. So I'll let you do your own deciphering here, whatever you think. Does this lusty bad boy boyfriend represent the new first man? Is this lustful relationship the new spark of God? I don't know. I'll let you draw your own conclusion to this. But this is it. This is Rococo. Today, not a lot of art historians or art critics ever look back upon the Rococo art movement, which dominated the 18th century, with much respect, because it was all so superficial. It seems disgusting and just hedonistic, just a celebration of the superficial. But some art historians say, well, that also makes it really modern. 200 or 300 years from now, what will historians think about what people posted on Instagram or TikTok or whatever? But just curious, did any of you, while you were looking at this, just get grossed out by it? Did you just think, wow, what a bunch of superficial, awful, disgusting, rich, stuck up, awful, disgusting people? Did any of you feel that way about this artwork? If so, if you did, you are in company with one man from the 18th century, who is the final artist that I will talk about in this lecture. He was French too. He was an artist, and he will dedicate himself to destroying Rococo art and bringing in a whole new type of art form. All right, so his name was Jacques-Louis David. Be careful, young Americans, with his last name, because you look at his last name and you're like, oh, his last name was David. No, it's not David. He's French. It's David. So Jacques-Louis David. Jacques-Louis David had a pretty rough childhood. When he was a young man, he was sword fighting with a friend. And in this sword fight, he got his cheek slashed, his right cheek slashed. So as you look at this particular self-portrait, you might notice that there's a little twist to the side of his face, the right side of his face. It's because he had a gash on the side of his face, and there was a benign tumor that grew there. David would never be able to speak properly throughout his adult life. When he was younger than that, when he was a boy, he saw his dad get shot in a duel, which is a pretty awful thing to witness. So, sword fighting, slashed cheek, watching dad get shot. David is not going to grow up a softie. He was encouraged to paint by his family, and he got so good that he was hired by, I kid you not, Francois Boucher. So David, apprenticing for Boucher, learned to paint like Boucher, and really paint for Boucher, but he will grow up to be sort of the anti-Boucher, the anti-Rococo. And all that had to do with not just his early childhood experiences, but a trip that he took. So David wants to be a great artist, so he decides to visit the home of the Renaissance, where all those great Renaissance masters are, Italy. And he goes to the capital of Italy, Rome, where he sees this, the ruins of the capital of the Roman Empire. And David gazed wistfully upon these ruins, reflecting upon what they meant. And here's what he saw. Once upon a time, there was constructed here a great city built by real men, men who dedicated themselves to fighting for justice and a republic. In ancient Rome, the Latin word for man was vir, V-I-R, vir, which is also the foundations for our word or words of virility, which is manliness, and virtue, which is being a good person. These were real men that lived here in ancient Rome. They were willing to fight. They fought the Etruscans and their decadent living. They fought the Carthaginians. They didn't let Hannibal take Rome. They fought the Gauls and the Goths, and they created an empire that expanded across the entire Mediterranean world. And it was an empire built upon virtue and virility, and it was a republic where people were free. But then what happened? Well, decadence happened. They grew powerful. They grew rich. They became corrupt. They became an empire with Caesars and a corrupt Senate. They became effeminate. They grew far more interested in wine and lovemaking than in fighting or protecting a republic. They grew weak, and eventually they were so weak and they were so corrupt that they just opened the gates and let the barbarians invade. And now, this is all that's left of the once great Roman Republic. That is what Jacques-Louis David saw when he took his trip to Rome. So when David returns home to Paris, he's a new man, transformed with a new vision, a vision that he's going to bring to canvas. He's going to paint how the world should be, a world that is not Rococo, a world filled with real men, virtuous men, virile men who are tough and who are willing to fight. And what do they want to fight for? Not a monarchy, a republic. So here we go. At the end of the 18th century, Jacques-Louis David delivers the death blow to Rococo art. In 1784, he paints the Oath of the Horatii. In the Oath of the Horatii, we see a father clasping 3 swords. He's draped with a blood red cloak, which is the center of the painting. Also in the center of the painting, we see his left hand gripping the cold blade of the swords. We can almost feel those swords cutting the skin of the dad. In front of the dad, we have the 3 brothers, the sons, swearing with a Roman salute that they are going to fight to defend the republic or die fighting. There is no soft sentimentality in the Oath of the Horatii. Remember Greuze's Girl Weeping Over the Dead Canary, Fragonard's Happy Accidents of the Swing, anything that Boucher painted, where everything's just happiness, having fun, making love, all that gone. These are real men, willing to fight, willing to die for justice, for freedom. This is Jacques-Louis David. Now, is there soft sentimentality in this painting? Yes, there is. Take a look in the bottom right-hand side of the painting. By the way, let me get the title off of it. Here we go. Yes, there is soft sentimentality. So we see the 3 women who are, of course, the 3 wives of the 3 men who are getting ready to go off and fight and die. They are crying. They are consoling each other. One of them is consoling a boy, the son of one of the men getting ready to go and fight and die. That boy might get orphaned, and mom is consoling him. This is the last time you might see dad. There's also, as I look at it, an even younger child that's also bearing his head into mom's lap. She's wearing all black. But those aren't the values that David is teaching us to care about in this image. In fact, he's teaching us to ignore those feelings. The real feeling is be a man, fight. That's what he's trying to communicate in this painting. And it's almost like he's like, women, shut up. Yeah, go cry in a corner. This isn't for you. We got real men's work to do here, fighting. And fighting for a republic. This painting made its first appearance in a royally funded, free, open to the public art show. It was held in the Royal Palace in downtown Paris of the Louvre in the year 1785. This was the very first art show in the Louvre, which is of course now probably the most famous art museum in the entire world. And it was open to the public too, right? So anybody from Paris could come and see it. And many people did. They lined up to come and see this painting. It became a sensation. And look at what is being communicated in it. So this isn't a painting for the aristocracy. This is a painting for the people. And this painting is saying, fight. Fight for a republic. This art show was in 1785. Across the Atlantic, the United States of America was already, we were already a free independent country, acknowledged by Britain as such in the year 1782. And how did we get free? Well, with a lot of help from the French. And those French soldiers, well, they were mostly commoners, led by aristocrats, but there were probably some veterans of the American War for Independence who were walking around the streets of Paris, living in probably something close to poverty, and they saw this. 4 years after this was shown publicly, France has a revolution. Now, the way I'm building this up and telling the story, I'm almost making it seem like this painting alone caused the French Revolution. That is not the case. There are obviously a lot of factors that go into the French Revolution and why the French Revolution happened. But the significance of this painting is that Jacques-Louis David will be providing the images for the French Revolution. In a day and age before television, movies, radio, people will draw their inspiration for why to fight and what they're fighting for from songs that they sing and images like this, paintings by Jacques-Louis David and his imitators. Jacques-Louis David is killing Rococo art and replacing it with something called Neoclassical art. Neo means new. Classical means classical civilization. Greece and Rome, they never go away. So new classical art, neoclassical art. And I have provided a rather informal definition for neoclassical art and a good way to understand it and how it stands in contrast to Rococo art. So neoclassical art, it's pretty much born with Jacques-Louis David, and I'll give it the birthday of 1784 when he paints the Oath of the Herati, or I guess you could say 1785 when it makes its first public appearance at a public art show in the Louvre, but then it influences much of the artwork of the 19th century. And I define it as a revival of classical images of virtuous manliness and a willingness to fight for a democracy like the Greeks had or a republic like the Romans had. Okay, so again, neoclassical art, really born with Jacques-Louis David. It brings back the images of ancient Greece and ancient Rome, but those images that are associated with a willingness to fight for freedom. So let's not confuse neoclassical art of the late 18th century with the Renaissance art of the 15th century, like Botticelli, like you see here. And it's tough because that word neoclassical means, well, to bring back ancient Greece and ancient Rome. And isn't that exactly what the Renaissance was? And yes, broadly, that's what the Renaissance was. It brought back ancient Greek and ancient Roman images. But the difference is in the content. So during the Renaissance masters were trying to bring back certain elements that the Greeks and the Romans had, certain elements of their own artwork and their own mythology. Let me be more specific here. So during the Renaissance, they were bringing back realism. They wanted to paint things to look realistic. In order to do that, they brought back Euclidean geometry so there could be perspective. They also brought back nudes. But then the content of the art, like what Botticelli painted or later on what Raphael painted, the content focused on mythology and philosophy. So it's more intellectual, as well as, especially with Botticelli, sensual. But you think of like Botticelli's Birth of Venus, like you see here, or any of his other works. Think of Raphael's School of Athens. There's no fighting in those great masterpieces of the Renaissance. There's a celebration of realism, of beauty, of mythology. There are those elements. So when you get to Jacques-Louis David with his neoclassical art, he wants to bring back really warfare, like the Greeks fighting the Persians or the Romans establishing a republic. Like that's neoclassical. The focus on that manly virtue to fight for either democracy or republic. So let me do with neoclassical art what I did earlier with Rococo art at the beginning of this lecture. So we're now going to shift away from Rococo's secular and natural themes, its asymmetrical painting, its gracefulness and its playfulness towards neoclassical art. So instead of focusing on the secular and the natural, we focus on classical civilization. A lot of images from ancient Greece, ancient Rome, and their willingness to fight for freedom. All right, I didn't talk a lot about the symmetry or the asymmetry of Rococo art, but once again, we're going back to the symmetry in neoclassical art, we're going back to symmetry in neoclassical art because symmetry represents order. Again, we're not focusing on things being graceful, but rather tough, rigid, and austere. Definitely not a lot of playfulness in neoclassical art. So we're going away from being playful to being virtuous, being manly, being willing to fight for justice. That's neoclassical art. Let me give you a couple examples of neoclassical architecture. So after the French have a revolution and they create a republic, they begin building buildings that look like they were imported from ancient Greece and ancient Rome. Buildings with columns. What can be more classical than a column? And just like the Parthenon had a frieze on the top of it, this sculpture carved out of the top, so too does the Palais Bourbon, which is where the French National Assembly, which is like the Congress of France, that's where they meet. And it looks like something straight out of ancient Greece, this architecture. So if you're looking at that and you're thinking, well, it kind of looks like what we have here, you'd be right. Here's the American Capitol, a shining example of neoclassical architecture. This, the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., where the United States House of Representatives and the United States Senate meet to protect our democracy. So what you should be seeing as you look at this building is neoclassicism. We should be willing to fight for our freedom. So David reflects the spirit of revolution of the late 18th century, the culmination of the Enlightenment, a willingness to overthrow the entire system, the system of monarchy, of a feudal hierarchy, of certain people being born better than others, a willingness to fight for the freedom of all people. That's what Jacques-Louis David represents in his paintings. Okay, now, before I speak too gloriously about Jacques-Louis David, understand there's very much a dark side to Jacques-Louis David. And in this, I'm going to foreshadow what happens during the French Revolution. So, with Jacques-Louis David's artwork, there's anger. There's anger. You look at the hypocrisy of the scenes from things like Fragonard's Happy Accidents of the Swing, the sensual, effeminate, superficial values of anything Boucher painted. And for David and a lot of people, you're like, oh, you're just disgusting. And you may be filled with a desire to destroy that element of civilization. For David, and for a lot of people, these aristocratic French people who lived this way while the majority of France was starving, they deserve simply to die. And of course, that's the spirit of revolution. Murder, killing the oppressors, killing the unvirtuous, killing the hypocritical rich. But how far does the killing go? In June 1789, a new group calling itself the National Assembly will declare itself the new government of France, representing the people of France. They will abolish aristocratic privilege. They will force King Louis XVI and his wife, Marie Antoinette, to be their hostage and to work cooperatively with them. But as soon as they do this, new forces are let loose in France. The poor rise up. Now, most of the men who started the revolution and began creating a new government, men that you see here as Jacques-Louis David started to paint them, but you'll notice this painting is unfinished, these men will die. And the National Assembly will be replaced with a new government called the National Convention. This National Convention will allow all men to vote throughout France, and anybody of money and privilege will die. There was even a new invention, a new form of execution that came along to better enable the French revolutionaries to quickly execute people. This was the guillotine, and the French National Convention instituted revolutionary terror. Kill the rich, kill the rich, kill the rich. But once you start doing that, where does it end? France became a place of hysteria, of people living in fear, and eventually, in 1793, an ordinary woman who lived in the province of Normandy in the north of France came to Paris, and she killed one of the men who was most responsible for the French terror. She killed him when he was in his bathtub, in his apartment in downtown Paris, by driving a knife into his chest. And then she stayed with him, allowed herself to be captured. She was tried by a jury and found guilty for murder. She claimed that by killing this one man, she would save 1,000 others. She wanted to stop the madness of the terror. That man who was responsible for the terror, his name was Jean-Paul Marat. The woman who killed him was Charlotte Corday. You will learn about both of them when we learn about the French Revolution. Now, so with this man dead, the persecution of anybody associated with the French aristocracy before the Revolution should be over, but not quite, because David painted him. This is David's painting, The Death of Marat. David intentionally painted Marat to look like Jesus after he was brought down from the cross. In other words, Jacques-Louis David made sure that Marat, who was a man who created paranoia in France, hysteria in France, calling for more blood of any French person, kill any French person who was an aristocrat or even in any way supported the aristocracy. That's what Marat wanted. He was a monster. But Jacques-Louis David paints him as a martyr. So David helps to start the revolution, and then he becomes the revolution's chief propagandist. He even celebrates those who murder indiscriminately in order to scare everybody to supporting their political cause. Jacques-Louis David celebrated Marat. He also celebrated Napoleon, the man who brought the French Revolution to the rest of Europe by trying to conquer all of Europe. And David was there to paint him as the glorious hero, conquering Europe to abolish aristocracy and to free the people. And it all began with the Oath of the Herati. And this concludes my lecture on the artwork of the 18th century and how things shifted from Rococo artwork to Neoclassical artwork. That's it, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you learned something. Boy, I love teaching this stuff. I hope you enjoy it half as much as I enjoy teaching it. All right, guys, that's it for me. Have a wonderful day. I'll see you next time.